What we're going to be looking at today are the different options we have for softening skin inside Photoshop. The first thing you want to do, open up your photo, and I'm just going to press the F key a couple times to get into full screen mode. And all I've done, this photo is pretty much straight from the camera. I've come in ahead of time and gotten rid of some of the blemishes, and basically went over here and got the healing brush tool. The healing brush tool is the only tool I've used on this photo up until now, and I can grab that and hold down the Alt key and select an area as the source point, and just come in here and just paint away some of the blemishes that I don't want in the image. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that because this tutorial is about softening the skin. And so what we're going to do first off is actually sharpen this photo a little bit. So with my background layer selected, I'm going to come up to filter, choose sharpen, and choose unsharp mask. I'm going to do a pretty light sharpening. I'm going to leave the amount at 100%, the radius at 1 pixel, and the threshold somewhere between 4 and 6 levels, they call them. So I'm just going to leave that. That looks fine. You notice that that did a little bit of sharpening. And so now what we're going to do is actually duplicate the background layer 3 times. So I'm going to hold down Control or Command on the Mac, Control and hit J 3 times. That gives me 3 layers down here. And the first layer I'm just going to rename Gaussian Blur. The second layer up here I'm going to rename Surface Blur. Third layer I'm going to rename Median Blur. And I'm actually going to take the opacity down on all these layers to 50%. Actually, I'm not going to do that yet, and you'll see why in a second. Alright, I'm going to hide the top 2 layers, come to Gaussian Blur, and we'll start with that. This is the one that most people are most familiar with. I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, choose Gaussian Blur, and you want the radius to be somewhere between 15 or 20 pixels for most any picture that you have. I'm just going to leave it at 18 for now. That's fine. Going to hit OK, and then take the opacity down to 50%. Now I'm going to hide that layer and then come up to the Surface Blur layer. I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, choose Surface Blur. And the radius, these 2 boxes, actually both of them, you want somewhere between 25 and 40 pixels. And I've come through here ahead of time and found the ones that work best for me. You basically want to find a happy medium to where there's a good fall off between your highlights and your shadows. And up here, there's such a harsh highlight on her forehead that you know, cranking that up really doesn't get rid of that effectively. But you know, I think it looks fine. It's going to help preserve some of the original detail in the end. So I'm fine with that. Your photo may or may not have these harsh highlights, but if they do, just make sure they're softened a little bit. But you mainly just want to have a really nice smooth fall off. So I'm going to leave my radius at 39 and my threshold at 35. Just hit OK. And Surface Blur is one of the filters that takes just a little bit to run. And the reason we're doing this is so at the end of this tutorial, you'll have 3 different options. You'll get to see 3 different types of blur applied to your photo. And that's really helpful, number one, in just kind of developing your own style and just finding out what Photoshop has to offer. So now that that's done, I'm going to take the opacity down to 50%. And I'm doing that simply by just clicking on the layer and hitting the 5 key. That automatically takes the opacity down to 50%. So I'm going to hide that layer, come up to the medium blur, make sure it's visible, and I'm going to go to Filter, choose Noise this time, and choose Median. And again, we're wanting to crank this up so that we're losing a lot of the detail, making the transition from the shadows to the midtones to the highlights, making sure there's a pretty smooth transition. I'm going to leave the radius there at 25, that's fine, and hit OK, and let this baby run. Median is, of course, another one that takes a little bit of time, sometimes not as long as the Surface Blur. So once that's done, I'm going to take the opacity down to 50%. So now we have all 3 layers at 50%. And I'm just going to come back to the Gaussian blur layer. That's the one that most people are familiar with. And I'm going to hold down the Alt key and click on the layer mask icon to create a black layer mask. And then I'm just going to come in here, grab a white paintbrush, make sure my foreground color is set to white. And I'm basically just going to paint over the skin. And you want to make sure that your black layer mask is actually selected before you do this, so you're not painting over your actual picture. And what I'm doing as I paint through this is I'm trying to avoid any areas that have a lot of detail. So the eyebrows I'm not going to hit, the little lines around the nose I'm not going to hit. Just going to do a pretty, I'm just going to go through here really quick just for the sake of keeping this tutorial on the short side. And just make sure we come in here, get this little area. Again, I'm using my left and right bracket keys to make the brush bigger and smaller as I need to. Just come up under here, and again, just try to avoid the transitions from like the lips. I'm not dipping down into the lips any. Just going right around them and right around this the line of the nose here. Okay, now once you think you have it all painted, then you can actually hold down the Alt key and click on the layer mask, and you'll see all the little areas that you missed. And some of these you obviously missed on purpose, but some of the other areas, sometimes it's hard to tell where you're actually painting. So that looks okay. Now here is where most people stop in the skin softening process. They'll do the face and they'll stop. But I urge you to go through here and actually do the rest of the body. Do all of the skin, any skin that's exposed, because as you can see already, even before we've done a lot of softening, there's a really big difference between the skin on her face and the skin on her neck and her shoulders. To keep this tutorial short, I'm not going to go through and do and paint over her body, but you know, on your photos, I actually would. But I'm just going to stop with the face right now, and that'll give us a good before and after. And you can see why a lot of people should continue on and do the rest of the skin. So, okay, now that we've got that, I'm going to hold down the Alt key and click on the layer mask, and actually click and hold and just drag it up to the next layer above it, and then do it again. Make sure you're actually holding down the Alt key before you click and drag. And so now we've copied that layer mask to all 3 layers, and so what we can do now is actually go through here and look at all 3 layers and see, you know, what type of softening the surface blur is doing for us, what type of softening the median blur is doing for us, and Gaussian blur. And you know, this is a really good comparison technique, because it gives you a good idea of the types of softening that are available, and they are, you know, a little different. There are little subtle differences between each of these little blur areas. So at this point we have pretty decent softening going on, and we can take this one step further. If I hold down the Command or Control key and click on the layer mask, I'm going to come back to the background layer and hold Command or Control J to jump that selection to a new layer. And as you can see, if I hide all these other ones, basically all I have is just a selection of the original skin from the background layer. I'm going to come up to Image, go to Adjustments, and choose Desaturate to desaturate that layer. Take all the color out of it. And now I'm actually going to run the high pass filter. I'm going to come over to Filter, choose Other, and choose High Pass. And I'm going to take this slider all the way to the left and gradually walk it up. I'm just hitting the up key, and you can hold down the Shift key and hit up to jump in bigger steps. And I'm going to take it to a point where some of these highlights are starting to become a little more evident. And most of the time you're somewhere between 12 and 20 pixels around that area. And I'm just going to stop there because I have such harsh highlights up here. I don't want to take it too far. So I'm going to hit OK and then change the blend mode of this layer to soft light. Now that brings back some of the original texture, and it's still pretty hot, so I'm going to take my opacity down to around 50%. Actually, somewhere between 30 and 50%. I'll just split the difference at 40%. And now you can see, if I hide that, the difference is probably a little too subtle for you to pick up on this video, but if you're following along with this tutorial, you'll notice that a lot of this the original texture is back in this image, and that, if you pair that with the different sharpening, you have a lot of flexibility and a lot of options at this point as to how you want to take your image.